Welcome to Avoidant Decoded, where we explore the hidden patterns of the mind, relationships, and emotional transformation. Before we begin this powerful journey into understanding avoidant psychology and the deeper meaning behind emotional detachment, make sure to join our channel membership and become part of a community dedicated to growth, awareness, and personal evolution. Now, let's uncover the truth behind what truly affects an avoidant and why emotional self-respect can create the biggest shift. Most people think the way to make an avoidant realize your value is by chasing harder, explaining more, or waiting for them to finally understand what they lost. But the truth is far deeper. What changes the dynamic is not your pursuit, but your ability to step back with peace, strength, and self-respect. When you stop feeding the cycle and start choosing your own emotional stability, something powerful shifts beneath the surface. And that is the moment when an avoidant is no longer distracted by pressure, but forced to face the reality of what your absence truly means. Most people think that going no contact is the one thing that finally shakes an avoidant. They believe that silence, distance, and disappearing will somehow make the avoidant realize what they've lost. But that idea overlooks something much deeper about how avoidant psychology actually works. Avoidants usually don't break down because someone is gone. In many cases, they adjust to that absence faster than anyone expects. What really unsettles them is something far more subtle, something they can't easily control, suppress, or emotionally escape. And once that shift begins, it starts to challenge everything they believe about connection, intimacy, and even who they are. One of the biggest misunderstandings about avoidant attachment is the belief that distance automatically creates panic. Most of the time, it doesn't. In fact, when a relationship starts to feel emotionally intense or overwhelming, space can initially feel like relief to an avoidant. The pressure fades. Their inner world becomes quieter, more manageable. That doesn't mean they didn't care. It simply means they've learned to regulate closeness through distance. For many avoidants, emotional dependency never felt safe in the first place. Growing up, their needs may have been ignored, criticized, or met inconsistently. So they adapted. They learned to rely on themselves, to hide vulnerability, and to avoid becoming too emotionally dependent on anyone. Over time, this turns into an automatic response. So when no contact begins, their system doesn't immediately register it as emotional danger. Instead, it feels like a return to balance. This is why so many people misread avoidance. They expect an instant emotional reaction, some kind of visible panic. But avoidants are wired for emotional containment. They process things slowly, internally, and often without showing it. So their first response to distance is rarely, "I miss them so much." It's usually more like, "Things feel calmer now." That calm feeling can be misleading. It's not proof that they didn't care. It's just the absence of emotional overwhelm. Still, that doesn't mean they're unaffected. Avoidants tend to process attachment in delayed stages. On the surface, they might seem completely fine, but underneath, their mind is still tracking the loss over time. The emotional pressure is gone, but so is the stimulation that kept the connection active in their thoughts. Another important part of avoidant psychology is their sensitivity to anything that feels like a threat to their independence. Even healthy closeness can create subtle tension inside them. As the relationship deepens, their system can start associating intimacy with losing their sense of autonomy. So when distance happens, their system relaxes again. This is why no contact doesn't always trigger immediate chasing behavior. What you're seeing is regulation, not indifference. They've simply returned to a familiar state where they feel in control. But the emotional impact often shows up later. Avoidants don't process connection through instant reactions. They process it through reflection. Memories begin to come back unexpectedly. Small reminders trigger quiet moments of awareness. They start comparing experiences internally. Sometimes this shift begins when they notice the other person is genuinely moving on. Other times it happens when emotional intensity is replaced by calm detachment. As time passes and the initial relief fades, their mind slowly begins to recognize what the connection actually meant. But even this isn't a straight path. Avoidants do form deep bonds. They just take longer to fully understand and integrate those feelings. Their system prioritizes staying regulated before fully feeling anything. Instead of one big emotional wave, Their feelings show up in pieces: a random memory, a sudden emotion, a quiet sense of something missing in the background. And often, they don't even fully understand what they're feeling in the moment. That's why no contact on its own rarely changes an avoidant. It simply removes the emotional cycle they were reacting to. Their system resets back to independence and control. Only later, if the connection truly mattered, does reflection slowly replace that sense of relief. When you look deeper, another truth becomes clear. Their biggest fear isn't immediately losing a specific person. Their deeper fear is losing control over themselves emotionally. Unlike anxious attachment, where separation can feel like everything is falling apart, avoidant attachment is more about maintaining control, independence, and emotional stability. To really understand this, you have to understand how they experience intimacy. Closeness doesn't automatically feel safe or comforting to them. Even healthy love can quietly increase vulnerability and a sense of emotional responsibility. As they become more invested, their system starts to feel like it's losing control. That discomfort often leads them to pull away, not because the connection doesn't matter, but because emotional exposure activates old fears around dependence. Their main strategy becomes staying in control at all costs. That's why so many people misunderstand avoidance completely. It's not that they're afraid of love itself. Many of them actually crave deep connection. What they fear is what that connection might do to their sense of stability and independence. So when no contact happens, they often feel like they've regained control. The pressure is gone. Their internal state feels steady again. But feeling stable is not the same as being emotionally resolved. And this is where the most important shift comes in. What truly disrupts an avoidant isn't chasing them, begging for connection, or trying to force emotions out of them. What impacts them the most is when someone becomes emotionally detached while still maintaining self-respect. That combination changes everything. Avoidants are used to a familiar pattern. Things get close, the pressure builds, they pull away, and the other person reacts emotionally. That reaction reinforces the dynamic they expect. But when that pattern is broken, when someone steps back without anger, without chasing, and without losing their self-worth, it creates something they're not used to facing. And that's the moment where things begin to shift internally for them. All the chasing, constant reassurance, emotional questioning, frustration, and repeated attempts to reconnect only keep a familiar cycle alive. One person keeps moving closer, while the other keeps pulling away. It becomes a pattern both sides unknowingly follow. But the moment someone responds in a different way, the entire dynamic shifts. Emotional detachment isn't about becoming cold, bitter, or distant in a harsh way. It's about stepping out of the emotional chaos completely. It means no longer chasing answers from someone who isn't willing to give them. No more over-explaining your feelings. No more reacting impulsively every time they create distance. Instead, there's calm control. There's emotional discipline. And alongside that, there's self-respect. Not as a tactic, not as manipulation, and not as silent punishment. It's simply the decision to stop abandoning yourself for someone who cannot consistently meet you halfway. And that's exactly what makes it so unsettling for an avoidant, because it removes the emotional patterns they unconsciously depend on. Suddenly, the system they're used to no longer works the same way. The pressure is gone, but so is the comfort of knowing the connection will always be there no matter how much they withdraw. For the first time, they're left alone with something they struggle to manage: uncertainty. Once the emotional pressure disappears, something unusual begins to happen in the dynamic. There's no tension to react against anymore. No one chasing them. No one demanding reassurance. No emotional reactions to their distance. And when that familiar pressure is gone, they're often faced with something even more uncomfortable than conflict: emotional neutrality. This is where confusion starts to build. Avoidants are often more used to emotional highs and lows than steady calm. Conflict, distance, pursuit, and withdrawal all fit into patterns they recognize. Even if those patterns aren't healthy, they are predictable. And predictability gives them a sense of control. But calm detachment changes that completely. When someone becomes grounded instead of reactive, the avoidant loses the signals they usually rely on to understand the relationship. The dynamic no longer fits the structure they know how to manage, and that quiet shift starts to reshape everything internally. What makes emotional detachment combined with self-respect so powerful is the message it sends without needing words. It shows that emotional access is no longer unlimited. In many avoidant dynamics, they get used to the other person always being emotionally available, no matter how distant they become. The connection continues, even when effort is inconsistent. But when that availability changes in a calm, self-respecting way, everything shifts. Distance is no longer followed by pursuit. Pulling away no longer guarantees the same emotional access. And this creates something deeply uncomfortable. Not panic, not immediate heartbreak, but uncertainty. That difference matters, because what truly affects avoidance isn't instant emotional pain. It's when their expectations stop matching reality. They expect chasing but find calmness. They expect emotional reactions but see consistency. They expect unlimited access but encounter boundaries. That mismatch creates internal tension. It forces them to observe. And avoidants are naturally observers before they become emotionally expressive. They process things through thinking first. They notice patterns, changes in behavior, consistency, and shifts in emotional energy more than dramatic displays of feeling. So when those familiar patterns disappear, they begin to reassess the connection internally. This doesn't always show on the outside. In fact, many avoidants may seem even more distant at first because their mind is trying to reorganize everything internally. But under the surface, something important is happening. The relationship is no longer running on autopilot. Self-respect is what makes this shift so impactful. Without it, detachment can easily turn into passive-aggressive behavior, emotional games, or silent treatment. And avoidants are highly sensitive to instability because it reinforces their deeper belief that closeness eventually becomes unsafe. But grounded detachment feels different. It doesn't feel chaotic or manipulative. It feels steady, calm, and contained. It shows that your emotional energy has value and is no longer freely given without mutual effort. And at the same time, it avoids creating unnecessary drama. That kind of emotional steadiness is difficult for an avoidant to ignore because it changes how they perceive the relationship. One of the biggest misunderstandings about avoidance is that they don't feel deeply. That's not true. They feel deeply, but they manage those feelings carefully. Their system is cautious, selective, and focused on staying emotionally stable. They aren't driven by emotional pursuit in the same way anxious individuals are. They're driven more by clarity. Clarity creates a sense of safety for them. They want to understand what the relationship is, what is expected from them emotionally, and how much vulnerability is involved. This is why emotional intensity often pushes them away instead of bringing them closer. In intense moments, their mind starts asking questions like, what is being expected from me right now? How much emotional energy will this take? Is this becoming too much? What if I can't meet these expectations? And when those questions feel overwhelming, they step back to regain clarity. The same thing happens during no contact. Their first response is often mental, not emotional. They think about what's happening before they feel it. Is this temporary? Is it permanent? What changed? Do I still have access to this person? What does this shift mean? These are cognitive questions first, emotional ones second. That's why emotional pressure and games rarely work long term. Chaos removes clarity, and when clarity disappears, they create even more distance to feel stable again. But when someone becomes calm, consistent, and emotionally grounded, something different happens. There's no chaos to escape from anymore. Instead, there's space. And in that space, they begin to observe. And observation eventually leads to reflection. This is why emotional steadiness, clear boundaries, and self-respect often have a deeper, long-term impact than chasing ever could. Avoidants are not naturally drawn to emotional intensity. They're drawn to understanding. And understanding only happens when things feel stable enough for them to process without feeling overwhelmed. The most important thing to understand about avoidant behavior is this: they don't move toward chaos, they move toward clarity. What people often see as emotional coldness is usually a nervous system waiting for enough stability to safely process what it's feeling. One of the biggest shifts in any avoidant dynamic happens when you stop being emotionally predictable. Avoidants pay close attention to patterns over time. They learn how people usually respond to them. If they pull away, the other person chases. If they become distant, reassurance increases. If they go quiet, the other person puts in more emotional energy to compensate. Over time, this creates a familiar pattern. Even if the relationship feels unstable, the reactions within it become predictable. And that predictability matters more than people realize. It allows the avoidant to stay regulated without having to fully face vulnerability. But the moment that predictability disappears, the entire structure begins to change. In many relationships involving avoidant attachment, there's an unspoken pattern that keeps everything going. Over time, both people fall into a rhythm where distance gets chased, silence still receives attention, and emotional withdrawal is met with increased effort. Without realizing it, both sides begin to rely on this cycle. That's why these relationships often feel like a loop, coming close, pulling away, reconnecting, then distancing again. But the moment you choose not to play your usual role in that pattern, everything begins to shift. When you stop pursuing during silence, stop over-explaining your emotions, and stop reacting impulsively to their withdrawal, the dynamic changes. The avoidant person no longer gets the familiar emotional response they've come to expect. At first, this doesn't usually feel like a loss to them. It feels more like something is off. The pattern they subconsciously relied on isn't working anymore. Their mind starts noticing that the usual reactions are missing, and once that happens, their automatic assumptions about the relationship begin to break down. They can't operate on autopilot anymore because the emotional rules have changed. This often leads to a period where they internally try to make sense of what's happening. They might subtly test the old dynamic, pulling away a bit to see if you chase, or creating distance to check if you'll react like before. Most of the time, this isn't intentional manipulation. It's their nervous system trying to figure out if the old structure still exists. But when your response stays calm, grounded, and steady, something deeper starts to happen. The relationship no longer feels emotionally reactive. Instead, it feels stable and self-contained. And that kind of emotional neutrality creates a different kind of uncertainty for someone avoidant. They can't rely on old patterns to predict what comes next. That uncertainty often captures their attention more than emotional intensity ever did. Instead of reacting automatically, they begin observing. They notice that access to you isn't as predictable anymore. Their distance doesn't lead to pursuit. Silence doesn't trigger emotional overinvestment. The push and pull dynamic they were used to is no longer in place. And it's important to understand this isn't about becoming inconsistent or playing games. Chaos and unpredictability tend to push avoidant people further away because it confirms their belief that closeness leads to overwhelm. The real shift comes from being calm and consistent. When your emotional state is no longer dependent on their behavior, you stop feeding the cycle they were used to. You become emotionally independent, regulated, separate from their patterns, and that changes how they see both you and the relationship. You're no longer someone who will always compensate for distance. Instead, you become someone who can stay steady without chasing connection. That shift affects how they perceive emotional access. When something feels guaranteed, people often stop valuing it. But when connection requires mutual effort and consistency, it becomes something they have to be aware of. It's no longer automatic, it's intentional. This is the real impact of stepping out of predictable patterns. It's not about forcing a reaction. It's about removing the system that allowed them to stay emotionally distant while still keeping the connection intact. Another common misunderstanding is thinking avoidant individuals change through pressure or emotional intensity. In reality, pushing harder rarely works. When emotions escalate through arguments, guilt, or chasing, it often triggers their defenses. Their focus shifts to calming themselves, not reflecting on the relationship. So they pull away even more to regain control. But calm accountability creates a completely different effect. Accountability isn't about punishment. It's about allowing natural consequences to exist without drama. If someone keeps withdrawing or avoiding emotional responsibility, the other person eventually stops overextending and simply steps back with self-respect, not reaction. Over time, the avoidant person begins to notice patterns. They start connecting their behavior with outcomes. When they withdraw, the connection weakens. When they avoid emotional responsibility, closeness fades. When distance goes on too long, access to you changes. This isn't instant regret, it's gradual awareness. And for avoidant individuals, awareness often starts with recognizing patterns, but that recognition only happens when the emotional environment is stable. When things are chaotic or emotionally intense, they don't reflect, they shut down. It's when the noise quiets that they can actually see what's been happening. At the core, avoidant attachment isn't about not caring. It's about needing emotional clarity, control, and internal balance. What looks like coldness is often a system trying to protect itself from overwhelm. They tend to re-engage only when things feel structured and manageable. That's why distance or silence alone doesn't create the kind of change people expect. Avoidant individuals don't usually respond to emotional intensity with longing. Instead, they often feel relief at first. Their system prioritizes calm over connection in the short term. The real shift begins when the familiar emotional patterns are interrupted, when chasing stops, when reactions become measured, when the push and pull dynamic disappears. At that point, their expectations no longer match reality, and that creates internal conflict, not panic, but confusion. Over time, that confusion leads to observation, and through observation, they begin to notice changes in access, availability, and the consequences of their actions. Not because they're overwhelmed, but because they're finally seeing clearly. But this only works when it's paired with emotional stability and self-respect. Manipulation, inconsistency, or emotional chaos will only reinforce their tendency to withdraw. Calm, grounded behavior, on the other hand, creates clarity, and clarity is what they respond to best. In the end, real change doesn't come from emotional force. It doesn't come from pushing harder or demanding more. If change happens at all, it comes slowly, through consistency, stability, and the quiet realization of patterns over time. It's not intensity that creates awareness. It's the absence of emotional noise that finally makes space for reflection. What truly shifts an avoidant is not silence, distance, or emotional pressure, but calm, self-respect, and emotional stability that breaks the old patterns they relied on. When you stop chasing and start choosing yourself, the dynamic moves from predictable reaction to uncertain reflection, and that's where real impact begins. It's not about forcing them to feel, it's about removing the system that allowed them to avoid feeling. And in that quiet space, where control fades and awareness grows, they are finally left to face the truth of the connection on their own.